"I don't have the passion anymore." These words came from Kurt Cobain in 1994, the frontman of the biggest rock band on the planet. While millions of fans screamed his name and his songs dominated radio waves worldwide, Kurt was quietly planning his escape from the very success that had made him a legend. This is the story of how three outcasts from a forgotten logging town accidentally started a musical revolution, then watched "I Don't Have the Passion Anymore." These words came from Kurt Cobain in 1994, the frontman of the biggest rock band on the planet. While millions of fans screamed his name and his songs dominated radio waves worldwide, Kurt was quietly planning his escape from the very success that had made him a legend. This is the story of how three outcasts from a forgotten logging town accidentally started a musical revolution, then watched in horror as fame became their prison. What you're about to discover isn't just about a band. It's about how success can become the most dangerous drug of all, and why sometimes getting everything you think you want can destroy everything you actually are. The irony is devastating. Nirvana spent years fighting to be heard, only to spend their final years desperately trying to escape the noise of their own success. Kurt Cobain, the reluctant voice of Generation X, became everything he despised about rock stardom, while millions of fans remained completely oblivious to his suffering. This isn't just another rock documentary. It's a psychological thriller where fame is the villain and artistic integrity becomes the victim. Aberdeen, Washington in the 1980s was a town slowly dying. The logging industry that had sustained it for decades was collapsing, leaving behind empty buildings, broken families, and a generation of kids with nothing to do but get high and dream of escape. Kurt Cobain was one of those kids, but his dreams were darker than most. By age 8, his parents' divorce had shattered his worldview, turning a hyperactive, happy child into what his mother described as sullen, mad, and always frowning. "I just remember all of a sudden not being the same person, feeling like I wasn't worthy anymore," Kurt would later recall. The divorce didn't just break up his family, it broke something fundamental inside him. He started acting out, getting kicked out of both parents' homes, bouncing between relatives like an unwanted burden. Music became his only refuge, but even that was tainted by his growing hatred of authority and mainstream success. When Kurt met Chris Novoselic, they bonded over their shared status as outsiders. Chris, a Croatian immigrant's son, felt just as displaced in small-town America as Kurt did in his own broken family. They started jamming together in the upstairs of Chris's mother's hair salon, creating noise that was part punk rebellion, part teenage angst, and part genuine musical innovation. Neither of them had any idea they were laying the groundwork for a cultural earthquake. The addition of various drummers turned their duo into a proper band, but success was never the goal. They wanted to make music that reflected their frustration, their alienation, their complete rejection of everything their parents' generation represented. When they finally settled on the name Nirvana, a Buddhist concept meaning freedom from suffering, the irony was already being written. They were about to discover that fame would bring them more suffering than they'd ever imagined. But first, they had to accidentally become the voice of a generation that didn't even know it needed one. In 1989, Nirvana recorded their debut album, Bleach, for exactly 606.17 in 3 days. It was raw, unpolished, and perfectly captured the band's underground aesthetic. Kurt was proud of it because it represented everything major labels hated. It was cheap, authentic, and completely uncommercial. The album sold respectively in the underground scene, and for a brief moment, Kurt thought he'd found the perfect balance between artistic expression and modest success. Then everything went wrong in the best possible way. Major labels started circling, offering money and resources that seemed impossible to refuse. When they signed with Geffen Records, Kurt convinced himself they could maintain their integrity while reaching a larger audience. He had no idea he was signing his own psychological death warrant. The recording of Nevermind should have been a dream come true. Professional studios, unlimited time, a real budget, everything they'd fantasized about during those early days in Aberdeen. But Kurt quickly realized that major label success came with strings attached. Suddenly, there were executives offering opinions about his songs, producers pushing for more commercial sounds, and marketing departments planning strategies to turn his personal pain into profit. Smells Like Teen Spirit became the song that changed everything, and the song Kurt grew to hate most. Written as a sarcastic commentary on teenage apathy, it was misunderstood by almost everyone who heard it. Fans treated it like an anthem of rebellion, completely missing the irony. Radio stations played it constantly, turning Kurt's critique of mindless youth culture into the soundtrack for mindless youth culture. When the song hit #1, Kurt watched in horror as his anti-establishment message was co-opted by the very establishment he'd been fighting against. MTV put the video in heavy rotation, turning the band into the kind of rock stars Kurt had always despised. The success he dreamed of as a struggling musician became a nightmare once he achieved it. The worst part wasn't the money or the fame. It was the realization that millions of people were completely misunderstanding everything he was trying to say. Fame hit Nirvana like a freight train, and Kurt was the one tied to the tracks. Suddenly, everywhere he went, people recognized him. Fans followed him home. Journalists dissected his every word, and photographers captured his most private moments. The shy, introverted kid from Aberdeen found himself thrust into a spotlight he never wanted and couldn't escape. I can't stand the thought of Francis becoming the miserable, self-destructive death rocker that I've become, Kurt wrote in his final note, revealing how deeply fame had poisoned his self-image. He'd become successful beyond his wildest dreams, but success had turned him into someone he didn't recognize or respect. The pressure of representing an entire generation was crushing him. Music journalists called him the voice of Generation X, the spokesman for disaffected youth, the leader of a cultural revolution. But Kurt felt like a fraud. He was just a damaged kid from a broken home who happened to write songs that resonated with other damaged kids. The weight of everyone's expectations was suffocating him. Chris Novoselic watched his best friend disappear into the persona that fame had created. Kurt had a really strong personality, Chris remembered, but the constant invasion of privacy, the pressure to perform, suddenly there were a lot of people who were relying on him. The friendship that had sustained them through years of poverty and obscurity was being strained by the very success they'd worked so hard to achieve. Dave Grohl, who joined as drummer just as the band was exploding into mainstream consciousness, found himself caught between his excitement about their success and his concern for Kurt's obvious distress. Could you see an inkling of him being uncomfortable with how big he had gotten? Oh yeah, definitely, Dave later admitted. But the real nightmare was just beginning. Fame wasn't just changing how the world saw Kurt, it was changing how he saw himself. By 1993, Kurt was actively rebelling against the commercial expectations that came with mainstream success. When it came time to record Nirvana's follow-up to Nevermind, he deliberately chose producer Steve Albini, known for his uncompromising approach and disdain for commercial polish. "I wanted to have the same sound that I have been carrying in my head since the beginning of this band," Kurt explained. In Utero was his attempt to reclaim Nirvana's artistic integrity, even if it meant commercial suicide. The album was deliberately abrasive, uncommercial, and challenging, minus everything a major label follow-up wasn't supposed to be. Geffen Records panicked, executives demanded remixes, radio stations refused to play the singles, and music journalists debated whether the band had lost their commercial touch. Kurt couldn't have been happier. "We're certain that we won't sell a quarter as much, and we're totally comfortable with that because we like this record so much," he declared. The MTV Unplugged session in November 1993 became Kurt's most vulnerable public moment. Stripped of the loud guitars and aggressive drums that had defined their sound, Nirvana was forced to rely purely on songcraft and emotion. Kurt was visibly nervous, asking that all the people who love me sit in the front because he was scared. The performance was haunting, featuring mostly covers and deep cuts rather than their biggest hits. Kurt's choice to avoid Smells Like Teen Spirit was deliberate. He was tired of being defined by a song he'd grown to hate. Instead, he offered glimpses of the artist he might. "I don't have the passion anymore." These words came from Kurt Cobain in 1994, the frontman of the biggest rock band on the planet. While millions of fans screamed his name and his songs dominated radio waves worldwide, Kurt was quietly planning his escape from the very success that had made him a legend. This is the story of how "I don't have the passion anymore." These words came from Kurt Cobain in 1994, the frontman of the biggest rock band on the planet. While millions of fans screamed his name and his songs dominated radio waves worldwide, Kurt was quietly planning his escape from the very success that had made him a legend. This is the story of how 3 outcasts from a forgotten logging town accidentally started a musical revolution, then watched in horror as fame became their prison. What you're about to discover isn't just about a band, it's about how success can become the most dangerous drug of all, and why sometimes getting everything you think you want can destroy everything you actually are. The irony is devastating. Nirvana spent years fighting to be heard, only to spend their final years desperately. Kurt's death should have been the end of the story, but fame doesn't stop for tragedy, it feeds on it. Within hours of the discovery of his body, news crews surrounded the house, fans gathered in vigils, and the media began the process of turning his suicide into another chapter of the Nirvana mythology. The irony was devastating. In death, Kurt became more famous than he'd ever been in life. His final note, meant as a private explanation for his actions, was read aloud at public memorials. His most personal pain became public entertainment. The fame he died to escape only grew stronger, fed by the tragedy of his passing. Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl were left to carry the weight of their friend's decision while the world demanded explanations they couldn't provide. We remember Kurt for what he was: caring, generous, and sweet, Chris said at the public memorial, trying to reclaim his friend's memory from the media circus that surrounded it. Dave channeled his grief into the Foo Fighters, building a new career while carrying the burden of being the drummer from Nirvana for the rest of his life. His success was both a tribute to Kurt's influence and a reminder of what might have been if fame hadn't proven so toxic. The conspiracy theories that followed Kurt's death revealed how little the public understood his actual relationship with fame. Fans couldn't believe that someone so successful could be so miserable, so they invented elaborate explanations involving murder plots and cover-ups. The truth, that fame itself had been the killer, was too uncomfortable for most people to accept. 29 years after Kurt's death, his story remains the ultimate cautionary tale about the dark side of success. Yet the music industry continues to churn out new artists, promising them the same fame that destroyed him. The cycle continues because we've learned to romanticize the tragedy rather than understand the warning. Kurt Cobain didn't die because he was weak or because he couldn't handle success. He died because fame, as it exists in our culture, is fundamentally toxic to sensitive, creative people. The same qualities that made him a brilliant artist, his empathy, his authenticity, his refusal to compromise, made him vulnerable to the psychological violence of celebrity culture. I simply love people too much, so much that it makes me feel too fucking sad, Kurt wrote in his final note. This wasn't the confession of someone who couldn't handle pressure. It was the testimony of someone who felt too deeply in a world that commodified emotion. Fame had turned his gift for connecting with people's pain into a burden he couldn't bear. The most tragic aspect of Kurt's story is how predictable it was. From the moment Smells Like Teen Spirit hit #1, everyone around him could see the psychological toll that fame was taking. His friends watched him retreat into drugs and isolation. His family witnessed his growing despair. His bandmates felt the tension building toward an inevitable explosion. Yet nobody knew how to stop the machine that was consuming him. The music industry's response to Kurt's death was telling. Instead of examining how fame culture might have contributed to his suffering, they turned his tragedy into a marketing opportunity. Unplugged albums, greatest hits collections, and documentaries followed, each one profiting from the very pain that had driven him to desperation. Even more disturbing is how Kurt's death became a template for rock star mythology. The tortured artist narrative, the idea that great art requires great suffering, the romanticization of self-destruction, all of these toxic concepts were reinforced by how his story was told and retold in the media. The impact of Kurt's death extended far beyond Nirvana or even the music world. For an entire generation of young people, his passing represented the death of idealism itself. If someone who had achieved everything they dreamed of could still be so miserable, what hope was there for the rest of us? The suicide rate among teenagers spiked in the weeks following Kurt's death, proving that his influence extended beyond music into matters of life and death. Crisis hotlines were overwhelmed with calls from young people who saw his choice as validation of their own despair. The very fans he tried to protect with his music were now at risk because of his final decision. Chris Novoselic understood this responsibility better than most. Suicide is not a solution, he said at the public memorial. It doesn't solve anything. It brings a lot of pain. But his words couldn't undo the damage that Kurt's example had already done to vulnerable young minds around the world. The media coverage of Kurt's death revealed society's fundamental misunderstanding of mental health and addiction. Instead of treating his struggles as symptoms of deeper problems, childhood trauma, untreated depression, the psychological violence of fame, they were presented as character flaws or lifestyle choices. This narrative prevented meaningful conversations about how to protect other artists from similar fates. Dave Grohl's subsequent success with the Foo Fighters became both an inspiration and a reminder of what Nirvana might have accomplished if Kurt had found a way to survive his fame. Dave's ability to maintain his sanity and humanity while achieving massive success proved that it was possible to navigate celebrity culture without losing yourself. But it also highlighted how unique Kurt's vulnerability had been. In the decades since Kurt's death, the music industry has only become more exploitative and fame-obsessed. Social media has amplified every aspect of celebrity culture that tormented him, creating new forms of psychological pressure that would have been unimaginable in 1994. Young artists today face not just traditional media scrutiny, but constant judgment from millions of strangers online. The streaming economy has made financial success even more elusive while increasing the pressure for constant content creation and public engagement. Artists are expected to be not just musicians, but brands, constantly marketing themselves and their personal lives to maintain relevance. The authentic artistic expression that Kurt valued above all else has become nearly impossible in an environment that demands constant performance. Recent artist deaths, Mac Miller, Lil Peep, Juice WRLD, follow disturbingly similar patterns to Kurt's story. Young, talented musicians achieving rapid success, struggling with mental health and substance abuse, and ultimately succumbing to the pressures that fame creates. Yet each tragedy is treated as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of systemic problems in how we create and consume celebrity culture. The romanticization of Kurt's story has made things worse, not better. Young musicians see his legend and want to emulate not just his music, but his tortured artist persona. The idea that great art requires great suffering has become so embedded in rock mythology that some artists actively seek out the kind of pain that destroyed him. Record labels continue to sign young, vulnerable artists and thrust them into the same machinery that ground Kurt down. The promise of fame and fortune remains irresistible, even when the evidence of its dangers is overwhelming. The industry profits from both the rise and fall of its stars, making genuine reform unlikely without external pressure. Kurt's death raised questions about fame, mental health, and artistic integrity that remain unanswered nearly 3 decades later. How do we protect sensitive, creative people from the psychological violence of celebrity culture? How do we separate the art from the artist without dehumanizing the person behind the music? How do we consume entertainment ethically when we know the human cost of creating it? The conspiracy theories that persist around Kurt's death reveal our collective inability to accept that success and happiness aren't synonymous. It's easier to believe in elaborate murder plots than to confront the reality that our culture's obsession with fame is literally killing the people we claim to admire. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Kurt's story is how preventable it seems in retrospect. If he'd had better mental health support, if the media had been less invasive, if the industry had prioritized his well-being over profits, if society had understood that fame is a form of trauma rather than a reward, any of these changes might have saved his life. But prevention would have required acknowledging that our entire relationship with celebrity culture is fundamentally broken. It would have meant admitting that the entertainment we consume comes at a human cost that we're not willing to calculate. It would have forced us to examine our own complicity in creating the conditions that destroyed him. Instead, we turned Kurt into a martyr for artistic integrity, a symbol of authentic rebellion against corporate culture. We made his death meaningful by making it mythological, which only perpetuated the cycle that killed him in the first place. "I simply love people too much," Kurt wrote, and perhaps that's the key to understanding both his genius and his tragedy. In a world that rewards cynicism and emotional detachment, Kurt's radical empathy made him both a brilliant artist and a vulnerable target. He felt everyone's pain as if it were his own, and fame amplified that sensitivity to unbearable levels. His music endures because it captured something true about the human experience: the loneliness, the alienation, the desperate search for authentic connection in an increasingly artificial world. Songs like "Come As You Are" and "All Apologies" remain relevant because they speak to universal feelings that transcend generational boundaries. But his death endures as a warning about the cost of that authenticity. Kurt showed us what happens when someone who feels too deeply gets caught in a culture that commodifies emotion. His tragedy wasn't that he was too weak for fame, it was that he was too human for it. The band that hated its own fame ultimately became more famous for that hatred than for their music. Kurt's rejection of rockstar mythology became part of rockstar mythology. His attempt to escape celebrity culture only made him more celebrated. Even in death, he couldn't escape the prison that fame had built around him. Today, when young artists struggle with similar pressures, Kurt's story serves as both inspiration and warning. His music proves that authentic artistic expression is possible even within commercial constraints. His death proves that success without psychological support and genuine human connection is ultimately meaningless. The saddest irony of all is that Kurt achieved exactly what he set out to do as a young musician in Aberdeen. He created music that connected with people's pain, that made isolated teenagers feel less alone, that challenged the artificial boundaries between underground and mainstream culture. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and that success killed him. Nirvana's story isn't just about one band or one tragic figure. It's about what happens when we mistake fame for fulfillment, when we confuse public recognition with personal worth, when we allow the machinery of celebrity culture to consume the very people who make it meaningful. Kurt Cobain didn't just hate his fame, he understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly why that hatred was justified. In the end, the band that hated its own fame became the perfect symbol for everything wrong with fame itself. Their music lives on as a testament to authentic artistic expression. Their tragedy lives on as a warning about the human cost of our entertainment culture. And Kurt's final words, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," remain a haunting reminder that sometimes the brightest flames consume themselves in the process of giving light to others. The revolution Nirvana started wasn't just musical, it was a revelation about the dark side of success that we're still trying to understand. Kurt Cobain's greatest achievement wasn't becoming famous, it was showing us exactly why fame, as we've constructed it, is fundamentally incompatible with human happiness. That lesson, written in tragedy, remains his most important gift to the world.